Julie Andrews has always been the picture of strength. Poised, elegant, unshakable. But there's one film she still can't watch without tears. One role the world will never forget. And one voice she can no longer hear the same way. Because The Sound of Music didn't just make her a star. It gave her something she'd lose. A friendship she'd never replace. A voice she'd never get back. And a memory so bittersweet, it still breaks her. And what she's just admitted about watching it now, decades later, has left fans in tears. There are roles that define a career, and then there are roles that define an era. For Julie Andrews, The Sound of Music was both. In 1965, Julie Andrews stepped into the role of Maria Von Trapp in what would become one of the most iconic and emotionally enduring films of all time. For audiences around the world, it was love at first note. Her radiant presence, her effortless voice, and her ability to connect with children, music, and joy all at once transformed what could have been a simple musical into something mythic. The Sound of Music didn't just make her a star. It made her a symbol. The film was based loosely on the true story of the Von Trapp family singers, but it was Julie who brought it to life. With her bright eyes and confident innocence, she gave Maria warmth and spark and soul. She made her funny and vulnerable, stern and soft in equal measure. Even when she wasn't singing, her voice carried through. Clear, steady, full of heart. And that's what people remember. Not just the visuals or the lines, but the feeling, the way Julie made you feel. She had a kind of joy that was infectious, but not naive. A kind of control that felt maternal, but never cold. It's why generations of families still gather around the TV every holiday season to rewatch it. Because Julie didn't just play Maria Von Trapp. She became her. But at the time, she didn't know how lasting this role would become. Coming off her Oscar-winning performance as Mary Poppins just a year before, Julie was still early in her film career. She had no idea that The Sound of Music would eclipse everything that came after, that it would become the performance she'd be most associated with, even into her 80s. At the time, it was simply her next job. A challenging one, certainly, but just one chapter in what she thought would be a long career of song and stage. Still, even on set, Julie could feel the magic. She would later say that filming in the Austrian countryside gave the production a kind of purity you couldn't fake. She wasn't performing in front of a green screen. She was actually running through the hills, actually twirling beneath the Alps. And that authenticity, she believed, made all the difference. Her connection to the child actors was real as well. During the months of filming, she became deeply protective of them. Between takes, she would often stay with them, playing games, singing songs, telling jokes. She became a kind of surrogate mother figure on set, something that only deepened the emotional truth of her performance. In interviews years later, the children said that Julie was exactly what you'd hope she'd be: kind, warm, funny, and utterly devoted. But what makes it all even more poignant is what Julie didn't know then. That one day she'd look back at this film not just as a highlight of her career, but as a window into a version of herself she would never quite return to. That the voice she carried so effortlessly through those hills would one day fall silent. And that watching The Sound of Music again would feel less like a celebration and more like saying goodbye. The image is timeless. Julie Andrews spinning through the Alps, arms outstretched, singing as the wind catches her skirt and lifts her voice toward the sky. To the millions who watched The Sound of Music, it was joy incarnate. But for Julie Andrews, filming that moment and the months that followed were far more complicated than anyone ever realized. By the time cameras rolled in Austria in 1964, Julie was already on a remarkable trajectory. Just a year earlier, she'd won an Academy Award for Mary Poppins, her first major film role. The world had fallen in love with her. Studios were fighting to cast her. Audiences couldn't get enough. But that kind of instant success doesn't come without pressure. And Julie, just 29 years old at the time, was carrying it all on her shoulders. While the sweeping vistas and charming musical numbers created a dreamlike atmosphere on screen, the production itself was demanding, at times even grueling. Filming took place over several months, bouncing between chilly soundstages in Los Angeles and remote, weather-beaten locations in Salzburg, Austria. The opening hilltop scene, for instance, looks effortless. But in reality, it was shot from a helicopter that repeatedly flew low over the field, flattening the grass and nearly knocking Julie off her feet. She did that spin over and over, each time waiting for the right moment when the wind and camera and music would finally align. And that wasn't the only hardship. Julie was also a new mother at the time. Her daughter, Emma, was barely a toddler, and Julie had to leave her behind in England during much of the European filming. The separation weighed heavily on her. She later admitted in interviews that the emotional toll of balancing motherhood and fame left her feeling unmoored, like she was always choosing one part of her life over another. There was also the isolation of being on location. Though she adored the children who played the Von Trapp kids and formed a strong bond with Christopher Plummer, Julie was often one of the only women on set. Many of the crew members were older men, professional, yes, but distant. She was admired and respected, but not always included. She described the experience years later as a little lonely, noting that the romantic imagery of the film stood in stark contrast to how quiet and internal the actual filming process could be. That silence gave her time to think. And while she remained ever the professional, never missing a note, never arriving late, never snapping under the weight, there were moments in her trailer, behind closed doors, when the emotions caught up with her. She missed her daughter. She missed the feeling of being home. And she began to realize that success, no matter how golden, often comes with sacrifice. Still, she pushed through. She gave the world her best smile, her clearest notes, her most radiant presence. But even then, a part of her knew this wasn't just a performance. This was something bigger, something permanent, a moment being captured forever. And that, perhaps, is what makes The Sound of Music so hard for Julie to watch now. Because when she sees herself on screen, spinning, laughing, singing, she doesn't just see a joyful young woman. She sees someone trying to hold everything together. A mother separated from her child. A performer doing everything she could to live up to what the world expected. And behind those hills and smiles was a heart quietly. It wasn't a love story, not in the way audiences imagined. But what existed between Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer was, in many ways, something even more rare. A deep, enduring connection that grew in the quiet spaces between scenes and lasted until the end of his life. When Christopher Plummer was first approached about The Sound of Music, he wasn't eager to join. In fact, he almost turned the role down. He worried the film would be too sentimental, too sugary, too simple. He famously referred to it as the sound of mucus in interviews, a jab at what he believed would be a sanitized, overly sweet musical. But everything changed when he met Julie. From their first rehearsals together, there was an ease, a rhythm, a kind of unspoken trust that made their chemistry electric, without ever needing to cross into real-life romance. Julie, the grounded Englishwoman with perfect pitch and unshakable grace. Chris, the classically trained Canadian with a twinkle in his eye and a devilish sense of humor. They were opposites in many ways, but perfectly matched where it counted. On set, they were often inseparable. Between takes, they'd share drinks, laugh at the absurdity of certain scenes, and confide in one another. Julie later said that Chris helped keep her sane during the longer, lonelier stretches of filming. And Chris admitted that he admired her work ethic, her humility, and, most of all, her ability to laugh at herself. She was so open, so easy to be with, he once said. And that voice, it was like hearing light. Their relationship had all the warmth and familiarity of an old married couple, without any of the drama. There was never any romantic tension, at least not outwardly, but there was affection, real affection, and in scenes like the wedding or their dance on the terrace, that intimacy bled through. That's why audiences believed in their love story, because something genuine was happening between them, even if it had nothing to do with attraction. Julie has often spoken about how safe she felt with Chris, how he made her laugh when she needed it most, and how, behind the scenes, he was far more tender than the gruff exterior he liked to show the world. He could be moody, yes, but he could also be incredibly kind. After The Sound of Music, their lives moved in different directions. They acted in different films, lived in different countries, and built separate legacies. but they never lost touch. They'd call each other occasionally, send letters, and always reconnect at anniversary events or tributes. And every time they reunited, it was as if no time had passed. Then, in February 2021, Christopher Plummer passed away at the age of 91. For Julie, the loss was profound. She was quiet in the days that followed. Then came a single, measured statement. "The world has lost a consummate actor. I have lost a cherished friend." But it wasn't the words, it was the silence behind them. The kind of silence that says everything. Julie had lost her captain. The man who stood beside her in that grand cathedral. The man who looked at her with love in his eyes, even when the cameras weren't rolling. The man who, more than anyone, understood what the sound of music truly meant. Now, when she watches the film, it isn't just about music. It's about memory. It's about grief. It's about seeing his face one more time, hearing his voice as he sings Edelweiss, and knowing he's gone. And that kind of loss, it never really fades. Of all the scenes in The Sound of Music, there's one Julie Andrews has quietly avoided. Not because it was poorly acted or difficult to film. Not because of anything the audience might notice. But because, when she watches it now, she sees something no one else can. She sees the moment everything changed. It's not the sweeping hilltop. Not the grand wedding scene. Not even the joyful curtain clothing montage with the children. It's Edelweiss. A soft, simple song, sung quietly by Christopher Plummer as Captain Von Trapp. His voice fragile, untrained, full of restrained emotion. In the scene, he stands on stage at the Salzburg Music Festival, saying goodbye to his homeland in front of a crowd he's unsure he can trust. Maria, played by Julie, watches from nearby. She doesn't sing. She barely moves. But in her eyes, everything is said. That moment, where the captain sings, "Bless my homeland forever," wasn't just a performance. It was real. Christopher was emotional while filming it. The cast and crew felt it. And Julie, standing just off stage, later said she could feel something shift in him during that song. Something private. Something vulnerable. It's that scene, above all others, that she now finds the hardest to watch. Not just because it marked the emotional climax of the film, but because it was so deeply tied to who Chris was and what they shared behind the scenes. He didn't like to sing, didn't think he was good at it, but he agreed to do it, and did it with a kind of trembling honesty that cut through every polished note. After his death, Julie admitted that watching Edelweiss now brings her to tears, not for the character, but for the man, for the memory, for the way he looked at her during the scene, for the way he held the guitar, barely strumming, just speaking the song into the air like a goodbye. And it's not just Edelweiss. There's another moment, quiet, almost easy to miss, that breaks her as well. The children's final performance. As the Von Trapp family sings together for the last time before their escape, Julie, standing as Maria, looks at them with a kind of fierce, protective love. At the time, it was a performance. But now, those children are grown, scattered across the world. Some no longer with us. And Julie is alone with the memory. She said in interviews that The Sound of Music is a gift that keeps giving, but that watching it has become more difficult as the years pass. Not because the film has changed, but because she has. "When I watch it now," she once admitted, "I see a version of myself that no longer exists. It's like watching someone else, someone I used to know." And for someone who lost her voice, the very instrument that carried her through those hills, that kind of rewatch isn't just nostalgic. It's painful. She hears the purity in her tone, the effortless high notes, the joy, and she knows that voice is gone. So when the camera cuts to Maria on the mountaintop, singing "The Hills Are Alive," it's not just a scene, it's a time capsule, a reminder of a voice that once soared and now only echoes in the past. And when Julie watches that scene, surrounded by silence, there's only one thing left to do. She cries, not just for Maria, not just for the captain, but for the woman she once was, and the voice she'll never hear again. To the world, Julie Andrews will always be remembered as one of the greatest voices of all time. Her tone, soaring, pure, effortlessly graceful, defined not only her roles, but an entire generation's understanding of musical storytelling. From Mary Poppins to The Sound of Music, her voice didn't just carry songs. It carried emotion, dignity, and joy. But what most people didn't know is that she lost it. And what came afterward was a kind of grief Julie rarely spoke about, until years later, when the silence became too heavy to hold. In 1997, decades after her rise to stardom, Julie underwent surgery to remove what were believed to be non-cancerous nodules on her vocal cords. The procedure was supposed to be minor. She was told she'd be singing again in no time, but something went wrong. When she woke up, her voice was damaged, permanently. She couldn't sing the way she used to, not even close. The instrument that had carried her through her most iconic roles, that had made her a household name, that had filled theaters and touched hearts, was gone. Julie would later describe that moment as one of the darkest in her life. It wasn't just the loss of a physical ability. It was the loss of a part of herself. It felt, she said, like losing a friend, a part of my identity. The public didn't know how deep the pain went. She smiled in interviews, carried herself with her usual grace. But privately, she began grieving. She entered therapy. She cried. She questioned her future. She sued the hospital for malpractice and eventually reached a settlement. But no amount of compensation could return what she'd lost. Her singing voice was her legacy, her lifeline, and now all she could do was listen. That's what makes watching The Sound of Music so complicated, because it captures her voice at its very peak. The opening number alone, "The Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music," is a masterclass in clarity and control. Every note is effortless, every phrase timeless. It is quite literally the sound of a woman in her prime. And when Julie watches it now, that's what she hears. Not just the music, but the contrast between what was and what will never be again. She has said she rarely revisits her old films, not because she's ashamed, but because it's simply too painful. The voice she hears on screen doesn't belong to the woman she is today. It belongs to someone younger, someone full of possibility, someone who hadn't yet known the silence that was coming. Still, Julie never allowed that loss to define her completely. In the years that followed, she reinvented herself. She became a best-selling children's author. She starred in beloved roles like Queen Clarice in The Princess Diaries. She lent her voice, her speaking voice, to roles in Shrek, Bridgerton, and more. And in doing so, she reminded the world, even when life takes something from you, there's always another way to be heard. But that doesn't mean the grief is gone, because grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, in a quiet moment, in a familiar melody, in the way a note lingers in the air before disappearing. So when Julie Andrews watches The Sound of Music, she doesn't just see a film. She hears a song she can no longer sing, and she remembers everything that came before the silence. For most people, The Sound of Music is a comfort, a warm memory, a story that begins with a song and ends with love. But for Julie Andrews, it's something else. It's a window into a version of herself that no longer exists. It's the sound of a voice she once had, and the silence she's learned to live with. It's joy and grief, wrapped in one perfect, bittersweet frame. She has said, many times, how grateful she is for the film's legacy, how honored she feels to have been part of something that means so much to so many. But beneath those words, always delivered with grace, there is something unspoken, quiet ache, because Julie Andrews didn't just play Maria von Trapp. She was Maria, bright, hopeful, overflowing with music. And now, when she watches herself on screen, arms outstretched atop that Austrian hill, she's not watching a character. She's watching a girl who could still sing, who hadn't yet learned what loss would sound like. There's a kind of courage in revisiting that, in choosing to sit with the memory, even when it stings, in letting the tears fall not because something was taken, but because it once existed at all. Julie's voice may be gone, but the sound of it, clear, full, radiant, still echoes through the hills, through the melodies, through the hearts of everyone who hears her sing Do Re Mi, or my favorite things. And perhaps that's the gift she gave us without knowing. A song so powerful, it kept singing even after the music stopped. For more emotional stories, check out this video.